Out front now, retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Peter Zwack, former U.S. Senior Defense Attaché to Russia, and Steve Hall, former CIA Chief of Russia Operations. Good to see you both tonight. General, if I could begin with you, we heard from what Ben laid out there. Ukraine's gains so far have been small, somewhat incremental. Now Ukraine is talking about these more than 180,000 men Russia has moved to the front lines. How do you think this will impact the counteroffensive?
First, let's dissect that 180,000 reported. They are looked to be out of their reserve formations that were not stood up long ago. And also the Storm Z companies, which are groups of convicts and things like that. So these are not elite first-string troops that they're committing. I have a suspicion a lot of the reserve forces that are being pulled out are probably not particularly motivated to be there, though they're considered voluntary citizens. You've got that. Most of the 300,000 of last fall have been committed. And so it's serious, their numbers. Quantity has a certain quality of its own, as Stalin would say, but these are not elite guys, but it is a factor. But it also may put stress, Erica, on the Russian people and the regime. The battle itself, the grinding Ukrainian offensive, these are probes. They're big probes. They're hard probes. They're looking for weakness. They have not committed their main force brigades that are looking, and we have to have tactical, operational patience for this to play out. And everyone said, including the Ukrainians, this would be hard and ugly.
Well, and as we watch, to your point, hard and ugly, and could take a while longer at that. Steve, I want to play another part, if I could, of Aaron's new interview with President Zelensky. Take a listen to this moment.
Mr. President, you recently said that you have dealt, and I'll quote you the way it quoted, with different Putins. It's a completely different set of traits in different periods. Now, of course, he's faced a rebellion, an attempted coup from Evgeny Prigozhin. Have you seen any changes in how you think he's acting, in his behavior since the attempted coup?
Yes, we see the reaction after certain Wagner steps. We see Putin's reaction. It's weak. Firstly, we see he doesn't control everything. Wagner's moving deep into Russia and taking certain regions shows how easy it is to do. Putin doesn't control the situation in the regions. He doesn't control the security situation.
What he pointed out there, that he believes he no longer controls the security situation. Steve, this mutiny by Prigozhin in Russia, how much of a lasting impact do you think it has had in terms of changes on Putin and even the power that he still does, or perhaps in some areas does not hold?
Yeah, Eric, I think that's the question that probably everybody is asking at this particular point. There are those Russia watchers who sort of say, look, we can't know a whole lot about what's going on behind the walls of the Kremlin because it's such a Byzantine place. That's absolutely true. But there's also some stuff that's happened on the ground that I think is irrefutable. The first is, how did the Wagner guys get as far as they did? I mean, I think everybody could probably have sat back and said, wow, this Prigozhin thing, it doesn't look like it's going to go well for the Kremlin. I mean, if we can see that, and all we have access to is general reporting, you can't tell me that the Russian intelligence services, specifically the internal service, the FSB, either didn't see this or somehow didn't send it up the line to the, I mean, how do you explain that? So that's either a lack of focus or a lack of, or an increased focus on something else to the detriment of Putin's regime, which is, that's job number one for all autocrats, is to stay in power. So I think we're looking at a weakened Putin. The question remains is how weak and what will his response be, because he's going to try to show that he's, of course, not weak. And that's going to, we'll see how that turns out.
Right. And there are a lot of concerns about what that could look like, understandably. General Zwack, you heard President Zelensky in that interview with Aaron talking about NATO, about whether Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. Talking specifically about President Biden, Zelensky said he knows that depends on him. It will be his decision. What do you make of that take? Clearly, there's a message in there. He talked about what a good relationship he and President Biden have. But that particular wording was interesting.
President Zelensky is a master of the narrative. And I think that going directly to President Biden can understand that, because there is strong American influence, obviously in NATO, toward that decision. But we have to remember, it's an alliance of 31 nations, and it just takes one or two that does it. So I think President Biden is acutely aware of the issues. How I think that the intent, and we're reading it all around, is more and more, not just in our own nation, but also in our allies, that there will be a day where Ukraine is worthy of NATO, certainly. I think the narrative that how the president, they're put some pressure on him, is, I think this is really, really hard. I think, though, that the Ukrainians have deserved it. They are certainly in the pipeline. But Article 5, an attack on one is attack of all. And Zelensky, to his credit, did mention that. You can respond and talk about the intent to bring Ukraine into NATO, but not a full invitation at the summit for the reasons we talk about.
As we watch to see what develops there, Steve, today the U.S. ambassador to Russia was able to meet with the detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. This was the first time since April 17th. Ambassador Lynn Tracy said Evan is in, quote, good health, remains strong despite the circumstances. He's facing espionage charges in Russia. The U.S. has refuted those, of course, called them baseless. But I wonder, based on what we were just talking about in terms of the recent issues in Russia and how Putin is in this moment, is it more or less likely that we could see something happen with Evan Gershkovich because of recent events?
Yeah, first of all, Eric, let me reiterate what you correctly said, which is the charges of espionage against this journalist, against really probably any Western journalist for sure, are absolutely false. This is something that the Russians do. It's hostage taking. It really has nothing to do with, a real police force and a real rule of law and real prosecutors. They've got all the trappings. They've got, courtrooms and stuff. But that's not what's going on here. He and all the other Americans and Westerners who are being held in Russian jails are simply pawns caught up in the game. And unfortunately, because of what we were just talking about in terms of how Putin is going to respond to the challenge by Prigozhin and perhaps some of his own generals, I think the outlook for these imprisoned Americans is even worse, because it would look weaker for Putin right now to say, well, yeah, okay, I'll do, the West a favor, or I'll do the United States what it wants. It wants these people released, so I'll go ahead and do that. That would look weak, and that's not something that Putin wants to do. He wants to do the opposite, to appear more strong in the threat that he just recently faced. And so I'm afraid it's probably looking worse for these imprisoned Americans rather than better.
Steve Hall, General Zwack, good to have you both with us tonight. Thank you.